got a three-way contributing at the top. Yours truly, Jody McDonald. Jeff Kerr is the sidekick today, and John McMullen will step into the guest spot to start the show. He's got COVID testing to get through today, and Johnny, may you fail your test miserably. No, I'm only kidding. Come on. Hope all is well with you, and glad to get both of you two guys here. McMullen, we will start with you since we know you got to exit stage left. Nick Sirianni yesterday met with the media, and I would say it was probably the toughest session that he's ever had with the media, just judging you guys, the assembled questioners who kind of put him through his paces yesterday. I thought he was good enough to hold back the fire, but it was the toughest media session he's ever had. How do you think he did? And am I correct in saying, yeah, the guys were out for a little blood yesterday?
I don't think we were out for blood. I just think there were some obvious questions that he needed to answer. The obvious themes, obviously no pre-snap motion, the running aspect of it, and then the discipline issue, the penalties, because he always talks about accountability. And then one thing I did want to get into, and I didn't, was his reaction to Derek Barnett and things like that. Because, Derek Barnett, and this is not a defense of him, he's made some boneheaded decisions, and they predate Nick Sirianni, but it's also not only him. I think he's been called for 2 of the 35 penalties officially. That's not him. That's not only him. So I don't think he can show that frustration as a head coach, but obviously you only have limited time. So there were some obvious questions. I don't think it was hard. I think he handled it fine. I think it's fair to, scratch your head at some of the answers, especially we consider, some RPOs that end up as a pass, a run. Well, Nick, maybe you should take away the maybe you should take away the option and just hand off the football. You are allowed to do that. It is not an indictable offense, even though some people who think the league is going a certain way think it is. It isn't. You're allowed to turn around and hand the football off, and take the option away from the quarterback. And when the same thing is happening over and over again, you can't just say, well, we consider this a running play. A running play is baked in. A running play is called. Well, you didn't run it.
John, I almost started a little battle on Twitter last night with my stat on the league leaders in yards per carry on first down, and it's Miles Sanders by a long shot. And someone said to me, well, that's a misleading stat. And from a guy who still plays a sport in tournaments where your average is your average, bowling, it's not misleading. It is what it is. Like, why doesn't this coach see this stuff? Like, if he's getting fed all this information, why doesn't he see that and say, oh, you know what? We might actually get ourselves in the second and manageable if we just give our guy the ball.
Well, I do think there's context, so I hate to agree with Twitter trolls, but I do think there's context. For instance, if you're Derrick Henry, and I say this all the time, and Miles has tremendous statistics over his first 2 seasons, he doesn't have the volume that those guys have. He's not given the attention those guys have as the top running backs in the NFL. So there is, the more you get it, the more attention you're going to get, the more those numbers are going to go down. And more to the mean, and then you really start to figure out who the best runners are in a league, and we all know who those names are. And Miles is a very explosive runner. He's certainly the best runner on this team, but I don't think he belongs in that conversation. So I'll start off with that. But I also believe he's got to be given the football, certainly on this team with these playmakers, more than 2 times on the ground in any football game. So that's what I'm saying. If you're in the guts of the game and you're calling RPO, and you're saying, well, there's the option. I mean, if the defender does this, we're going to hand the ball off, and it's just not happening. That's where you have to put on the brakes and say, now we got to get the football to this guy. This is the same coach who said it's about players, players, players first. So if your original plan isn't getting the football to one of your best players, you have to go players, 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 and cross out that original plan and go to something else. And that's where I say, take the option off the table. I was very worried about this collegey, and I use that term a little tongue in cheek, but I was very worried about this offense getting really repetitive really quickly. And I didn't think it would happen this quickly. And we're here pretty quickly.
J-Mac, I'll give you one of the answers that Nick gave that I kind of rolled my eyes at. Talking about accountability, talking about players not doing what they're supposed to do, a.k.a. Taking penalties. He said that when they're in game film reviewing afterwards, sometimes they say, hey, we've got to do this. And then sometimes they say, hey, we've got to do this. Really, raising your voice is going to get the guys to not jump offside, not go downfield too quickly on an offensive lineman on a passing play, which may or may not be a passing play because it's an RBO. Nick raising his voice is going to remove the penalties from the Philadelphia Eagles, the most penalized team in the NFL. Did you find that kind of eye-rolling too?
No, I didn't. Maybe I'm just used to Nick at this point. I kind of know what he was trying to say. Sometimes it's just a quick adjustment, and sometimes you just roll through it, and it's obvious. And other times you gotta. I think he was trying to say you got to raise your voice. You got to be a little bit more angry about it. I think he was just trying to explain the dichotomy of different situations. But yeah, I guess I talk to the guy 3 times a week, so I kind of get a feel for him. So to others who don't get to see him that much, maybe it comes across. He but that's part of his personality. Part of his, and that's why day one everyone was like, "What the heck is this?" Now that we're deep into it, I kind of know what it is. I don't think personally, I don't think that was a big deal, but I can see how others would say, oh, what is this guy doing? But I just think that's his personality. He's trying to explain the differences in certain penalties. And yeah, dumb personal foul is probably a little bit more than a questionable holding call on an offensive lineman. On the latter, you might just say, get your hands inside, borderline call. On the former, on the penalty, on the personal foul, you might have to say, this is stupid and call the player out.
John, I saw one of the memes yesterday on Twitter. I guess it was Nick Sirianni holding the paper or whatever. What was he trying to explain on that? I must have missed that yesterday.
Yeah, Nick's great. He held up his game plan. I tried to get a picture of it, and I'm like, can I blow this up? He put it out there for everyone to see. I thought that was funny. That was yesterday. He was trying to explain when he grades plays, and he puts the number of the player who made a mistake on the bottom left-hand corner, and then obviously makes the corrections. So it was one of those things. And I don't want to stop Nick Sirianni from doing that stuff, to be honest, because I think it's valuable. It explains how he does his job. It gives some context. And that's the kind of stuff I think is good that maybe other people say, what is he doing? And I think it's always, the more information you get, the more explanations you can give to the fans, I think is a good thing. And the last thing I want to do is put him in a shell where he doesn't offer up that kind of information. I love when he does stuff like that, to be honest.
All right, here's one of the questions that wasn't asked yesterday, John, that I was hoping was going to be asked, because I don't really know what Sirianni's answer would be. I would guess that would be a non-answer, but I'd still like to hear him attempt to answer it. And it's a very difficult question to ask because it's very subjective. So far, the Eagles this year have had massive penalty problems and pretty major injury problems. And they handled their preseason, and I consider preseason. I won't even, if you want to, you can go all the way back to the summer when they had their non-mandatory workouts and take it all the way up until yesterday. Or you could start it just from training camp. Any way you start it, the Eagles have worried more about not doing too much and not worried at all about not doing too little. Well, how do you correct not doing enough? Well, you can't because it's already come and gone, and they look like an underprepared team. The injuries, very subjective. Could more work have gotten them in better condition, built their bodies to not get hurt? Who knows? Well, we know what the results are, and the results aren't good. They've had major injuries to major players. The question I would have liked to hear to ask was, if you had a chance to do it all over again, do you think you'd put some more work in before the season started? What do you think the coach's answer would be?
Well, I think we have asked them that kind of numerous times throughout the process, and it's, kind of he always defaults to, he takes, listens to the advice from the training staff, the medical staff, and formulates a plan. And he's always said, ultimately, it's up to him, which I don't think is true. I think it's an organizational decision. So in a lot of ways, in fact, I know it's an organizational decision. So in a lot of ways, it's out of his hands as far as that stuff. Look, I think it's funny, you have that term sports science. I think it's funny when you put the word science on something that's so uncertain, because nobody can point to an avenue and say, this is the way to do it. This is the way. The Eagles are like everybody else. They hire these guys and they say, this will help us get through the season. Our players will be fresher. I always say you can't legislate injuries. I guess, to a certain extent, you cannot play guys, not practice guys. They're probably not going to get injured sitting down in a meeting room. But when they get out to practice, and you saw it last week with Jordan Mailata, it doesn't even have to be a game.
Right.
This is a sport where guys are going to get hurt. And the aging guys with an injury history are more likely to get hurt. So they developed their plan. They hired the people they believe in, and they're using that plan. But it's fair for people. Yeah, it's very fair for people to question it, especially with this organization's history with injuries. But I think most of that has to do with sticking with aging players with an injury history. And I don't know how. I mean, I can't advocate moving on from Lane Johnson or they were thinking about trading Brandon Brooks, but with that contract, they weren't going to get any bites. So, I mean, I guess you got to run it back. I don't know what you can do with players like that other than try to manage them through the week and get them to the game. I think that's what you should do. I think that's a very difficult answer, and I think it's out of the purview of Nick Sirianni, but he's tried to answer it many times, and he said he's not the expert when it comes to the training methods and the medical stuff, and that's other people, and they give him the advice, and this is what the Eagles have decided on. The problem is Howie Roseman might be making these decisions instead of Ars Darnota, who's their chief medical officer, and Ted Rath and Tom Hunkel are their, sports science guys.
Speaking of Howie Roseman, I saw Jeff McMullen got to ask Nick Sirianni about his, I guess, since Doug had the weekly meetings with Jeffrey Lurie, if Nick partaked in them. And he said, I go in there every day. And I'm like, oh, boy, it's probably not the answer he should have gave, but, it is what it is. What did you make of, Nick Sirianni basically going into his CEO pretty much?
Well, everybody knows Jeffrey Lurie's involved. So I think, and I can't speak for Jeff, but I think he was just trying to get on record of when it happens. Everybody knows Jeffrey's involved. I do, the Peterson meetings were organizational meetings. So Jeffrey would have essentially Howie, Doug, and Don Smolensky, which I think is funny for this reason. So take after the famous story about Green Bay, where the Eagles upset Aaron Rodgers in Lambeau Field, and Jeffrey Lurie's asking Doug Peterson, why didn't you pass the football more? They ran it. They were very successful. And I get a kick out of it because it was an organization. It wasn't a meeting with Doug Peterson per se. It was the organizational meeting with his heads of each department that he had every week. And then I could just imagine he would go to Don Smolensky and say, what about the recycling efforts at Lincoln Financial Field? That was the meeting. That it was an organizational meeting. It wasn't a football meeting. He was asking Doug Peterson about his expertise, then Don, then Howie. And so I do think that was a little bit overblown by how they did it. But everybody knows Jeffrey's involved. Everybody knows if the head coach isn't going to talk to Jeffrey Lurie, well, yeah, eventually he's going to come talk to you. I do find the hire more and more interesting as it goes on for a couple reasons. Nick Sirianni doesn't seem to be much of an analytics-based coach, which surprises me. Seems more old school, seems far lesser analytically driven than Doug Peterson was. And that doesn't kind of mesh with Jeffrey Lurie. And then offensively, again, with the collegey RPO type stuff, that's not what Jeffrey Lurie likes. So maybe it comes down to he just convinced him that he was a leader. And I hope that's the case because that would make more sense when he went this direction with the hire.
John, your story about, and I'd never heard that before. Thanks for sharing that with me and with all of Birds 365 Nation here, that it was an organizational meeting and it was more than just Howie and Doug and Jeffrey in the room when he asked them about throwing more against the Packers after an upset victory in Lambeau. That bothers me more. If I'm Doug Peterson, it would tick me off more. Wait a minute. We just won a game and you're going to ask me in front of the president why I didn't pass the ball more? You don't want to take me aside and go, hey, could we have thrown the ball more? No, in a formal meeting with other people, you're going to call me out after we got an upset win in Green Bay? For me, that makes it even worse if that was the case.
Well, I do think ultimately Doug was upset by it. I don't know if that's why, but that could be an explanation of it. But I certainly do know he was upset about getting asked about a win, about how he went about, style points essentially, when the NFL is supposed to be about winning by hook or by crook. That's what everyone says. So style points shouldn't apply, should never apply. And he was upset. For it's tough to get past the obvious reasons for why you're upset. I mean, any head coach, I think, would not take it well if you win an NFL game, because they're very hard to win. And somebody comes in and says, "Oh, but you should have won it by this," essentially. And meanwhile, the other side, the other side is it's sort of like the biggest question I had for Nick Sirianni in all of this, and after the game especially, was when he said, well, we knew we wanted to keep pace with Dallas. We knew they were going to be able to score points. And I said this yesterday on the show, Jody. No, you don't match punches with Mike Tyson in his prime. You try to outbox him. You don't go at, I hope he learned this week. Let's try to outscore Patrick Mahomes. Let's try to be a faster pace offense. You got to go about it a different way. That was the most concerning part of the whole thing to me.
John, this is one thing I wanted to bring up too. Everybody says, well, the Chiefs could be 0-3. I look at it as they could be 3-0. I've watched every Chiefs game. I basically watch them like I do the Eagles. I rewatch them once or twice. And turnovers just kill this football team. They have 6 turnovers in their last 13 possessions. They probably beat LA if they don't turn the football over. Mahomes got a little too fancy on a couple plays, and just inexcusable fumbles by Tyreek Hill and Clyde Edwards-Helaire were a part of that. And to me, it just seems like that's how you beat the Kansas City Chiefs. I know there are different ways to do it, but basically have an Andy Reid team beat themselves. Did Nick Sirianni address that at all, or Jonathan Gannon yesterday?
I think Nick Sirianni will learn from what happened in Dallas. I certainly hope so. I don't, I know Andy Reid wouldn't take could be 3-0. I mean, they don't care. That's NFL games. You could take, especially close games, you could take a play or two in each game and say, we could have won this one. Yeah, but you didn't. And especially a team with that kind of success, they're never going to use that as an excuse. On paper, it doesn't look good because they're upset. They know they've beaten themselves. And they're good. And they're really good. And at some point, that's going to show up. And right now, the Eagles aren't really good. So, I mean, if you want some optimism, I guess you have to say, well, hopefully Kansas City doesn't figure it out for a couple more weeks. Because if they figure it out this week, and they've had a lot of adversity, obviously Andy going in the hospital, number one. But he's back. Maybe that's a little bit of a distraction. Maybe they do turn it over. But the Eagles haven't forced a ton of turnovers, to say the least. It just looks like a tough matchup on paper, a really tough matchup.
Yeah, I wanted to further that turnover conversation because I want to give credit to Hargrave because he's played as well as he has. The one turnover they have gotten in 3 games, they didn't really force in a way. Hargrave pushed a Cowboy player into Dak Prescott and he gave up the football. They didn't even get their hands on it until Fletcher Cox just happened to look up and say, oh, look what I've got. And he grabs it out of midair and then goes swimming on the ground. So the whole hits feeling of doing things, philosophy of doing things hasn't really turned into a lot of turnovers so far. Yeah, the Chiefs were just a mess last week, turning it over 4 times. Is that something you are heavily emphasizing if you're Jonathan Gannon this week? We've got to do exactly what the Chargers did. If we don't get 3 turnovers, we're not going to beat the Kansas City Chiefs. Is that something you think the coach will rely on?
Well, I think he always stresses it. He does always stress it, but you can't game plan for turnovers. I mean, same thing what I said about the Chiefs, okay. But, Javon Hargrave made Dak Prescott uncomfortable enough to do what he did. So that to me is certainly a generated turnover. And it was funny because we asked Darius Slay, no interceptions. He said, Fletch got one. And we said, that was a fumble, buddy. We had to tell him it was a fumble. It was ruled a fumble. So Slay is funny with the rules. It's so over legislated he can't figure them out. But it's yeah, I mean, the turnovers haven't come. They keep saying they come in bunches and all the cliches, and they do. I mean, they do. That's how this league works. But it also works that, playmakers. Trevon Diggs makes plays. He makes plays. Finds a way to make. There's a young player. Now, he also takes some chances. I mean, that's part of it as well. Guys who turn the football over, especially in the secondary, are guys who are confident to take chances and talented. I don't see a lot of those guys on the Eagles outside of Darius Slay. And then you couple it with they just play a ton of zone. So you don't give players who are willing to take chances. Like if you had a Trayvon Diggs, they're not going to have as many opportunities to take chances. So then you're left with quarterbacks making poor throws, overthrowing people, things like that, where you're playing center field. And that's what Anthony Harris did so well in his previous life. So I mean, I don't think they have a ton of playmakers in the back seven. I've been talking about it for a long time. So, the front four's got to make the plays.
John, concerning comments that you brought up Darius Slay, and I know where he was getting that at, but I can't wait to ask a couple Chiefs players this about Patrick Mahomes. And Darius Slay was asked if Patrick Mahomes is best, most talented quarterback he's ever faced, and he said, "Well, no, basically he said I face Aaron Rodgers twice a year, and he's never faced Patrick Mahomes." So I don't know. I feel like this comment, even though it's not that big of a deal, it really could bite him just because Mahomes and the Chiefs offense could make a point this Sunday.
Well, one, I agree with Darius. I mean, Rodgers is, and Jody knows, I feel this way. Rodgers is the best quarterback in football when he's clicking on all cylinders. And you saw him 37 seconds. That's all he needed. That's not his slight. He was very complimentary overall to Patrick Mahomes. Everybody knows Patrick Mahomes is a great quarterback. Is very difficult to stop. Darius Slay knows that. Jonathan Gannon knows that. Everybody knows that on the Eagles. But yeah, I don't know where we've gotten in sports where you make these comps and you say, "Oh, I think Aaron Rodgers is better than you," and that's not essential. I mean, but that was what Slay was getting at. Like, that's not an insult to anybody in the history of the world. This was like the DK Metcalf thing with Jim Schwartz, who said DK isn't as good as Calvin Johnson. Oh, that's a slight to DK Metcalf? That's a slight to his knowledge of history, because if he thinks he's Calvin Johnson, he has no flipping idea. And that's, if players are going to take those things, and that's what Jim said at the time, there's nothing you can. I mean, you're not insulting the guy. And Slay wasn't insulting Patrick Mahomes. If he wants to use it, though, and that's the way some of the Chiefs go with it, that's fine. But you can't compare some. If you're in the same sentence with Aaron Rodgers, you were just complimented.
Right. I wholeheartedly agree with your stance on that, John. Someone who's not going to be compared, certainly because they're not quarterbacks, but on the level of their talent with Aaron Rodgers at all, Eagles offensive line fill-ins as of right now. They've got to come up with a bunch of them, both guard positions, and still to be determined left tackle. The coach didn't want to tip his hand yesterday and said we will actually keep that to ourselves for the purposes of keeping the other team uneducated as to what we're going to do. Whether they would move guys around from the two guard position, maybe put Herbeck back on the right and bring Dickerson over to the left. Whether Mailata would be back in time for this week's game, don't know that that's going to be the case. Either way, Jeff Stoutland's got his hands full, and he's got to come up with some answers for this team this week. Yeah, they all got the chance to get their hands dirty last week, and your boy Dillard actually played pretty well. I give him credit for a better game than I thought he was going to have. How much of a disadvantage are they at this week? Is Kansas City's defense going to make them pay a price? Dallas' defense wasn't considered to be all that good, but they played pretty damn well the other night against the Eagles. How does this matchup the Eagles just put together on the fly offensive line against the KC defense look for you?
Yeah, it was funny when Nick said that, because I was the one who asked him that question. He was like, "We think we have a competitive advantage this week." So I'm thinking to myself, well, two things. I don't think the Chiefs care whether Suo Peta or Nate Herbig or Landon Dickerson are moving places. And the second thing is, are they not practicing? Did they scale back to a walkthrough so we couldn't see who's the starting offensive line? And does that mean they're not going to practice today so we can't see the starting offensive line? I mean, I don't know for a fact, but Jordan's not going to play. I mean, sprained knee, usually the best case scenario is 2 weeks. So he didn't practice yesterday. It's just an estimation because it was a walkthrough. So it's probably going to be Dillard at left tackle. Then you start talking about guards. And you want Landon to get the reps, obviously. So I asked the question for the reason that Isaac's out for the year now. Brandon Brooks is going to be back at some point. So do you just want to make the move now and keep him at left guard for the rest of the year? And Nick didn't want to go down that road for competitive advantage, whatever. And I'm Kansas City's not going to be worried about any of the possibilities. They're just going to show up and play. I am more interested because Dillard did play well, but I said leading up to the week that was a perfect situation for him, Jody. You probably remember this. Dallas doesn't have DeMarcus Lawrence out there. They don't have any pass rushers. They were down, I think, 6 defensive linemen. All they had was Randy Gregory coming off the COVID list. So it was a perfect situation. He took advantage of it, and he played a solid game. This week, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. And I am interested. That's one of the things, if he does play, and I think he will play, as I said, how Andre Dillard holds up. Because if he continues to play at least an acceptable level, that'll make it easier for the Eagles to make a move at the trade deadline because they've made their decision to left tackle. And the better Andre plays, the better it is for the Eagles to get something on the back end.
John, obviously, Eagles fans are probably fearing the deep bomb from Patrick Mahomes to Tyreek Hill, but the one I'm worried about more is how is this team going to cover Travis Kelce when Dalton Schultz just kind of went off on him last week? Kelce's had 6 catches for 75 yards in each of his 3 games. Like, how do you counteract? I mean, he's going to get his, but how do you try to slow him down?
Well, one, you have to stop the run, and I know that doesn't make sense. But once once the Cowboys started rolling and the linebackers are taking that step forward in those zones, trying to plug, that's 7 yards coming basically every play, 6, 7, 8 yards. Then all of a sudden they went over the top, and you could see on the one touchdown, Alex Singleton wasn't deep enough. Why wasn't he deep enough? Because he's trying to plug the holes in the running game. So I think that would help if they could stop the run. They could at least, bracket him a little bit better. But this guy's the best receiving tight end in football. He's going to make plays against the best defensive plans. He's a great route runner, understands how to get open. Sort of like Zach Ertz from the route running perspective, but with more athleticism, more playmaking ability. It's a tough matchup. It's a tough matchup for everybody. So, I imagine every team that plays Kansas City gets the Kelce question and how are you going to deal with him? It's like any superstar player. If you give up to go the NBA route, if, guy scores 40 and you give up 30, it's probably a good day.
Agreed. Kelsey's going to get his this Sunday. All right, John, last thing, and appreciate it. And we'll let you get off in testing after this. We haven't brought up Jalen Hurts yet, 33 minutes since the show started. And I think that's a good thing, as a matter of fact, because certainly he can be a guy who could be questioned. And another good thing was, at least in my media followings, you got yours, listening to the radio, reading all you guys who cover the team. Nobody's brought up Deshaun Watson yet this week. And when that
Chris
game
Sims
ended,
brought him up. Jake
Who
Glazer
did?
brought him up. Chris Sims, your buddy, brought him up.
Okay, all right.
Jake Glazer brought him up. Yeah, it never ends. Chris Sims and this has been out there for a long time. I mean, the Eagles have tremendous interest in Deshaun Watson. Jeffrey Lurie gave Howie Roseman the green light to make a trade. If he can make a trade, that's been out there for a while. Nothing's changed from the Watson perspective of doesn't want to play here, has a trade, no trade clause. Now, from the Eagles' perspective, if nobody else wants him, and ultimately Philadelphia's the only option, I think he would change his mind to get out of Houston but I don't see that happening. And that's the Jay Glazer part, who said Houston is starting to lower its demands, and Miami is still by far the leader in the clubhouse. So people are mentioning him. As long as Miami's an option, as long as Miami is interested, I don't think the Eagles are in the conversation because he doesn't want to play here.
And he does
Not
have the
because
no-trade.
not because they trust their quarterback, because he doesn't want to play here.
Right.
The Eagles want Deshaun Watson. I've said that 100 times. I'll say it to my dying breath. They want Deshaun Watson. I don't think there's a path to get him.
And there's a bunch of moving parts in there. And the fact that he has a no-trade clause is a major impediment if the Eagles do want to get their hands on Deshaun Watson. J-Mac, good job, brother. Thank you very much. I will see you back here tomorrow morning when we talk about the Chiefs winning by 3 touchdowns. Now, I might be tipping my hand here a little bit, but we'll get your take tomorrow. Thanks for jumping on today.
All right. Thank you, guys.
J-Mac, John McMullen here on Birds 365. All right, Jody McDonald, Jeff Kerr, got plenty to still sink our teeth into. Hour number 2, going to have a buddy up, Matt Verderam from Fansided, covers the entire league, does a league-wide podcast. It's very good as well. But he's a Kansas City guy. He grew up in Kansas City and has been a Chief fan his whole life, always has a good perspective on the Chiefs. So we're going to get Matt Verderam of Fansided up in hour number 2. We come back. More with Jeff Kerr and Jody McDonald here on Birds 365 next.